Welcome to the Rise and Form podcast. We'll throw us in here. We have Dr. Adam Dell here with us today, and he currently is offering clinical services through his private practice and in medical settings throughout Indiana. He teaches a trauma certification program at Wheaton College. From 2020 to 2024, he served as Director of Emotional Wellbeing at the Notre Dame Wellness Center with Premise Health. And then from 2014 to 2020, he served as Active Duty Psychologist with the U.S. Air Force. He draws on 20 years of clinical experience to offer insight and practical solutions on the topics such as the psychology of behavioral change, clinical health psychology, religious coping and meaning making, acceptance versus avoidance, relationship enhancement, marriage and family issues, psychology of suffering. We're so happy to have him, and let's just get into it.
Yeah, good to have you here, Adam. And we're just so interested in just kind of getting to know you as well and hearing about you. And we're just curious. One of our friends, and who's the director of operations for Rise and Form, said you should reach out to this guy. And I saw your stuff, and I thought, oh, you're like right across the things that we're doing, and you're interested in psychology, you're interested in Christianity and how to apply biblical thinking to psychology. And we've been, what's it called? Binging your TikToks and Instagrams and stuff.
Yes, so, I had a whole session of and I was like, I can't click all 600 of these.
Thank you. I sometimes think about when I connect to things like this, what my 6 or 7-year-old self would have thought if he knew he'd grow up to do something like this. Not only on the internet, because that was back in 1990 or business when there was no internet, but also just because it's just such a special opportunity to spend time with the two of you and whoever may listen. So thanks for having me.
Yeah. No, it's a pleasure. It's a privilege to have you. And we always start with a question, in our title, Rise and Form. We like talking about rising. We like talking about forming. And this one is just to hear a little bit about from you, formative moment or experience that profoundly shaped who you are.
That's such a fascinating question, because it's really the reason why most people come to see a psychologist, because something happened that shaped them.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've learned from Chip and Dan He, who are two brilliant brother authors, they wrote perhaps the best behavior change book I've ever read, which maybe is for a different podcast, but just a brilliant, I've used that throughout my career. But they have this other really brilliant little book that I think a lot about as a dad, and it's called The Power of Moments. And in the book, they talk about why certain moments rise above the prose of our lives to be punctuation points. And these things tend to be elevated or novel. Sometimes they involve pride or accomplishment. They almost always include connection. And they're usually, the fourth component of it is there's a lot of insight, like tripping over the truth. Elevation, novelty, connection, insight, and pride. And I can think of no other moment in my life where those four coalesced more perfectly than when I became a dad. And so I think after years and years of infertility, which was my issue, I have a really low sperm count after several surgeries on my testicles. We knew that it was a me issue, and we thought the doctors had told us it's not 0, but it's as close to 0% as it could get. And so when we welcomed Adeline Grace in 2019, that's just, my whole life changed. And there was a coalescence there of connection, elevation, insight, and pride.
Wow. Happy Father's Day. For yes.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. So we actually welcomed Addie in 2019. It's so interesting. I was preaching a sermon at a church in Oklahoma on one of my favorite stories from all of Scripture about a kid named Mephibosheth from 2 Samuel. A story about brokenness and being found by David and by Hesed love and being kind of restored into a familial kind of place. And yet, from Mephibosheth, the first thing you learn about him and the last thing that you learn about him is that he was lame in both of his feet. So even though he was found and loved and rescued and brought to a palace and given a seat at the king's table and given land and opportunity, the story ends and he's still lame in both of his feet. And so I'm telling this story And in a vulnerable moment, I just felt like I wanted to share with these group of people in Oklahoma about our infertility issue and how even though I've been found and loved and we've been saved and redeemed and we have a seat at the king's table, infertility is still a part of our journey,
Mm.
like that brokenness. And my wife was sitting on the front row with tears coming down her eyes, and she was pregnant, and we had no idea.
Oh
It was
my
unbelievable.
goodness.
no.
So we welcomed Addie in 2019, and then Amelia Joy was born just last year,
Wow.
actually.
Wow.
She just turned a year old.
Two
Yeah.
blessings. Ugh.
And maybe you're tired. You must be a little bit
Just maybe.
Tired. Yeah. Should have seen how much hair I had prior to becoming a dad.
I
in
can
my
relate.
30s.
That
Yeah.
it went.
Yeah, no, and the grays in the beard started popping up, and I've got to.
That's exactly. No, so much play and joy. It's the
I'm-
kind of stuff that brings you to life, not take it away.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is just that's goosebumps and
Mhm.
beautiful, and thank you for that. And yeah, I think,
Yeah.
just love to the parents for just how we get to have that, and grace and empathy for those who want that so bad and don't get to have that. And I think maybe we're talking about that in some ways today, just some of the sufferings and griefs in life
Yeah.
and difficult things
That's
that,
exactly it.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think Lil Gibran is a poet that I've been so drawn to, and I share quite a bit actually in clinical settings with people. He's got this beautiful little book called The Prophet. And in that book, there's a little poem called On Joy and Sorrow. And I don't have the whole thing memorized anymore, but he talks about how joy and sorrow are actually inextricably linked. And so there's phrases in the poetry like, the same well from which we draw buckets of laughter was once filled with our tears.
Wow.
And the deeper that sorrow carves into our being, the more room there is for joy.
Wow.
Now, there's no promise in Judeo-Christian worldview that joy will be complete in this world.
Yeah.
And yet, what a beautiful thing to think that sometimes in this world, there's flashes of calculable grace that fall.
Yes.
And also that we have this eschatological hope that one day he will wipe away every tear from
Yes.
our eyes, and there'll be no more death or mourning or crying. Pain, those great promises in the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
And so, there's these moments where heaven kisses earth. The Celtics referred to that as thin spaces where heaven gets really close to earth.
Yeah.
And you almost can't tell the difference. And
Mhm.
for Janine and I, my wife, certainly two of those giant punctuation marks where there was heaven's face was when we welcomed our girls. And yet we also knew yours where you weren't pregnant.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
wherever people are at, you just often think sometimes poetry and stories
Mhm.
they are more instructive than instructions could ever hope to be.
Mhm.
Yeah. It paints a picture of a
Just
really.
that I shared.
Yeah. It paints this things that like just mere words and let me describe this doesn't get across. You have like word picture in a way through the poetry. And it is true and something to hold, especially as Christians of like, there is pain and suffering in this world, especially because of the fall. And we have a joy to look to. And it doesn't negate the other. They are like interconnected. Absolutely. Yeah. Let me throw us into a question of just kind of like definitions, just to get a baseline for us. Starting to talk about suffering, and one major suffering point is trauma. That's what a lot of us deal with and find ourselves exposed to at some point in our life. And so this word is thrown around a lot. So I think it's good for us to kind of define what that is. Have you, Adam, define what that is when you're talking about it? Yeah. So give us, your definition.
And I think you're right that trauma is probably an overused word in our culture. And so I'll talk to you about what clinician Adam would refer to as a traumatic event, or what trauma is. Really, it's the after effects of a horrific life circumstance. And the National Center for PTSD has a terrific website right now. Anyway, it's ptsd.va.gov. I don't have any affiliation with them, but our website has great definitions, introductions to different evidence-based therapy approaches, research on pharmacology versus therapy, even really fascinating holistic approaches, just tons of apps and resources for people to learn more, for those that love others that have been traumatized. When we think about trauma, something horrific happened where you're exposed to things of the level of death, threatened death, serious injury, or threatened serious injury, sexual violence, either because it directly happened to you, you witnessed it, you learned about it happening to someone that you love, or interestingly, in one of the more recent editions of our diagnostic manual, even the indirect exposure to that level of violence or threat over time in professional duties, which is one of the reasons I think why clergy have such high burnout rates, why psychiatrists have high suicide rates. Repeated indirect exposure to stories like that can also be enough of trauma exposure to develop really 4 categories of after effects. And I'll just give you the Cliff Notes version of it. The first one is what Hollywood does well with, where there's re-experiencing that occurs. The trauma event is re-experienced in terms of dreams, in terms of vivid recollections, even when someone is conscious. We sometimes refer to these as flashbacks. That's one. Another one is that avoidance starts becoming a theme song in somewhere blank. And so trauma definitionally is horrifying, and a person almost feels like necessarily they need to avoid anything in their mind in terms of memory, but also externally that could remind them of the danger that they survived. The third kind of after effect category is negative alterations or a darkening of emotion and thinking. People who have been traumatized tend to have bleaker views of themselves, the world, the future, and even God. And the final thing is almost like arousal type symptoms. People can be more than before the trauma exposure, irritable, hypervigilant, have an exaggerated startle response, hyper-aroused. This really is just the consequence of pituitary adrenal gland, hypothalamus pituitary adrenal gland overactivation. You're in fight, flight, freeze mode a lot, super activated, and therefore always on edge. And so things like that can sometimes be the case. When people have those clusters of symptoms, that's what would eventually give rise for a clinician after a certain period of time to say, I think that this person might have post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good, like, clear view of, like, this is actually what we're looking at, and maybe a two-parter. But what are your thoughts on relational trauma, attachment trauma, and then your own definition of trauma as well? So, twofer.
Yeah, well, when I teach about this, we look at the American Psychological, American Psychiatric Associations, but also the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies is a very large, more global organization, a little bit more representative of the trauma literature that exists, although it's not very robust in major areas of the world where there's just not infrastructure for epidemiological research. But in this study, they largely break types of trauma into 2 categories. The first is interpersonal trauma. That is between person trauma. And the overwhelming majority of those instances are physical or sexual violence. And oftentimes the person that's being traumatized and the person that's being the traumatizer, they know one another. The other big category for traumatic events is non-interpersonal trauma. That would be anything from a motor vehicle accident to a hurricane, tornado, or tsunami. What we know overwhelmingly from this international epidemiological research is that interpersonal or between person trauma has the highest likelihood for walking people in the direction of post-traumatic stress. Now, that's not to say that a house fire or a tsunami would not be lethal, threateningly deadly, and horrifically devastating. And could people get post-traumatic stress disorder from those things? Absolutely. And I oftentimes think about those 2 categories. The other thing that I think about a lot, and something that could, I think, be saving for any one of us as we reflect on the unique things that we trot down the road in the direction of, is that when trauma exposure is studied in children, adolescents, and adults in our country and around the world, the overwhelming story that the data tell is that human beings are remarkably resilient. a very small percentage of people who have trauma exposure actually develop PTSD. That's true even for kids, and that's true even when refugees are studied and people who have experienced suffering.
Yeah.
However, what we do know is that trauma exposure and repeated trauma exposure over time has a cumulative effect. And so what that means is that if any one of us was exposed to a single traumatic event, chances would be way better than not that we would not develop PTSD. I find myself sharing this data with parents quite a bit as a psychologist. Parents, especially who've experienced trauma in their own history, will bring it and they'll think that the worst possible thing has happened, that their child, despite all of their intentionality and efforts to protect that kid, has experienced something evil and potentially traumatizing. And their thinking is, this kid is going to have to live with this for the rest of their life. And the reality is that the overwhelming majority of kids, something approximating 75% of kids, take a resiliency pathway and they don't live with after effects for the rest of their life. It's overwhelming majority of kids don't. But if a person, young or old, is repeatedly exposed to traumatic events, I think about my military service and battalions of Marines getting deployed and redeployed, for example, into settings where we know there will be trauma exposure. There is a cumulative weight that builds, which means it's not a matter of if, but when trauma exposure eventually catches up to people. So when I think about populations that are very vulnerable to this, I sometimes even think about professions, the people that work in hospitals or EMTs, fire and police services, counselors, individuals that are basically bearing witness to the suffering and trauma that falls into the lives of other people in a compassionate way, actually run the risk of having a lot of compassion fatigue or even secondary traumatic stress, which sometimes can look an awful lot like PTSD. So that's how I think about them. And frankly, I like to just kind of align myself with the empirical literature on what trauma is.
Yeah.
I know that there's a lot of individuals that have a platform and they can kind of talk a lot about different definitions for trauma or what they feel has been traumatic or what they think might be traumatic in other people's lives. I think that there's been so many decades of research on kind of the clinical literature. And as a clinical psychologist, I kind of land there for my definitions for traumas.
Yeah, that's
Awesome.
good. Yeah, I'm just thinking of pastors, counselors. There's, just like what you were saying, people in that field and that in those industries and the cultures of, in Australia, we say, she'll be right, which is you'll be okay. You don't need anything, right? You're the strong one. How I think Nadine Burke-Harris's work with the ACE study, and which she really demonstrated that we need at least one person to talk to, one safe person to talk to about what we're going through. And so for us, even in our fields and people who are listening to this that work with difficult situations, just to have a space to contain you, someone to hold you as you talk about the things that you've been hearing or been exposed to can be so
well, and isn't
healing.
that something, right? It's from a theistic or Judeo-Christian worldview. God exists within himself in a relationship, and then he created us in his image. And at least in part, I think what that means is that we are relational. We are designed and created for a vertical sense of relatedness to him, but also designed also for horizontal relatedness. And that might be, at least in part, why between persons, trauma has this uniquely pernicious after effect. And yet, where the malady is oftentimes also where you'll find the cure.
Yeah.
Where the place where I've experienced woundedness and brokenness by another person in the sense of interpersonal betrayal type trauma can find restoration in being known and loved and cared for, not perfectly, but fairly consistently in an attachment with someone else. Yeah. And it's for that reason, to be totally candid with you, that I think therapy can be helpful for some, but not for all. And a deep, deep friend, like the kind that Aristotle wrote about to his son, kind of communion that we find, like even in Romans 12, like love must be sincere, hate what is evil, cling to what is good, be devoted to one another, and love and honor one another above yourselves. This type of thing isn't therapy, but
Yeah.
perhaps could be more therapeutic
Yeah.
than therapy.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
kind of like the question I sometimes ask my clients is, have you told anyone else about this? Do you have any friends you talk to that's safe? Or I'm like, oh, maybe that's something that needs to happen, right? We need to
Yeah.
push into that and develop safer friendships outside of therapy, because it's great and it's amazing that you've disclosed something to a therapist. But yeah, like we're a helping professional and you need to walk with someone in life as well
Yeah.
outside of that. And yeah. I was going to ask about, you just talked about post-traumatic stress so beautifully, and about post-traumatic growth and just what we
Oh,
mean when we talk about that. Yeah.
Yes, bring it.
yeah, we've got to talk about that,
Yeah.
right? And
Mhm.
it's something that I, at least in my limited experience on this planet, I don't think that most of my dearest friends or neighbors or and classmates are as familiar with that construct as they might be with post-traumatic stress. And some of my best professors would define constructs by what they're not. So one of the things that I'd like to clarify up front is that post-traumatic growth is not the opposite of post-traumatic stress.
Mm.
So if a trauma event unfolded in the life of someone and they took a resiliency pathway after it, meaning trauma is awful. One of the reasons why holding Adeline for the very first time and like looking into her sweet little blue eyes and saying like, I'm here. There's something so elevated and novel about that, because I had never had that experience before. Like to a lesser degree, this is why any of us that went to college remember more things from our freshman year than the last three, because everything was so new.
Mm.
Trauma is a new experience the first time that it happened. And oftentimes we don't even have language or ability to comprehend it. Like active shooter scenarios. Like no one has said like, where did the last 25 times this has happened? Or sexual violence. It's like, you have a hard time even comprehending exactly what's happening. And that's why it rises above as something which we're definitely going to have as a salient imprint in our memory network. And yet, if people take a resiliency pathway after a trauma exposure, it's upsetting to them. And yet they don't have that kind of clustering of those 4 domains. They're able to cut back into their life without a lot of re-experiencing and avoidance and a darkening of their cognitions and thinking, and they're not quite so hyper aroused. And within a few days or weeks, they're back to normal. They don't have amnesia for what happened, but they're able to live their life and take back the territory in their life that they might have given up. And that's what happens for the majority of people. But if someone falls into the category of repeated trauma exposure that builds, or they happen to have a trauma exposure, even if it's just one, and the World Health Organization would estimate all of us are going to have at least 3 or 4 of these in our lifetime, but they have something and there is that after effect. And months later, they're avoiding, they're haunted by memories, they're even experiencing them at nighttime. It's for those individuals that post-traumatic growth is possible.
Mhm.
So it's like that the broad idea of the deeper that something carves into you, the more room might be for healing. And Sadeshy and Calhoun have probably the most prominent theory of post-traumatic growth, although there's several. But the reality is that it's for the trauma survivor who's been deeply marred by trauma. It's not a guarantee, but there is the possibility of post-traumatic growth on the other side of that as part of the healing journey. And there's an inventory that you can look at online that's free, the post-traumatic growth inventory, the PTGI, it's been administered in many different countries in many different languages. This is a theory, and yet I stand on the basis of 20 years of experience and personal experience in military and civilian settings to say that this is unquestionably a real thing that occurs. And the domains are related, they're distinct, but certainly related. And so I don't know if it'd be helpful to go through what those 5 domains are.
I think so. Why not? Yeah, because I was curious speaking, what does that look like?
So one of the things that I hear people say these things, like I oftentimes in the class I teach at Wheaton, I talk about how it's a Herculean privilege to bear witness to the hell of someone's history, maybe as that first person that they've ever said these things out loud to. Also, it's an inexpressible joy to bear witness to these domains unfolding in the life of someone, not only surviving a traumatic event, but experiencing new life on the other side of it. And so the 5 domains very quickly are like a deepening of appreciation for life. So some survivors will say, it's after that in a seminal event that I came to realize how much I was taking for granted.
Mm.
And there's just been this unfolding of gratitude for the simple and the most important things. The second domain would be a deepening in someone's ability to relate to or have empathy with others. And I couldn't tell you an accurate number for how many people I've met in my career who, as a result of going through interpersonal betrayal type trauma or something very adverse and difficult, set them on a path to being a help or a hope or a hand to others who are in need. New possibilities in life is the third domain. So where someone potentially experiences something traumatic and then new opportunities to serve or to thrive or to live. I think of like the Wounded Warrior program, for example, that I was proximate to in the United States Air Force, where individuals would experience a traumatic brain injury or a loss of a limb and a blast injury. And now they're on a path of being motivational speakers or accountants or something, not a Marine. It's like, I have new possibilities in my life. And that thing was a big turning point for me. The fourth is personal strength. And this is where a survivor with tears in their eyes and courage in their heart says, I am the woman or the mama or the child of God that I am today because I went through. And the fifth one, which is profound, and it happens a lot, is that there are major spiritual and existential changes that can occur in someone's life, the other side of trauma, where they have a deepening of their appreciation for and connection to religion and spirituality.
Yeah.
I love those. I think that kind of even starts like getting us into that when we talk a lot about like rising out of things. And this is like the act of rising out of trauma. And so let me throw this out there and see if we can kind of tie in there. But experiences where people have felt powerless, threatened, terrified, all of those, how do you rise out? So maybe what is the process? This feels weird to ask it this way, but I'll tease it out. The process of like maybe the post-traumatic growth, can we cultivate it in some ways? And are there things that make it harder? Things that keep people from rising out of and getting into that space?
Yeah. Boy, could we ever talk a long time about that question. Several things come into my mind. And one of them is that avoidance, which is one of those four kind of main after effects for trauma survivors that can start to become a real pattern, really keeps people stuck. And again, if a child touches a hot stove, they immediately recoil as long as your bodies are working correctly because they know that it's harmful. For a lot of trauma survivors, avoidance in the immediate aftermath of the trauma event makes sense. Weeks and months and years later, it keeps them stuck. And avoidance actually is a self-amplifying loop for anxiety. And so a trauma survivor will say, because that happened to me, I will never, or I cannot. Now, from acceptance and commitment therapy, which I think is one of the better researched forms of therapy in the last 40 years, and I certainly use it a lot with people, it's deeply impactful in my own life. One of the tenets of that theory and approach to therapy is that really the vast majority of our self-inflicted suffering comes from the rules and the stories that we tell ourselves about what we are, what we're not, about what we can do and what we can't do, about where we can go and where we can't go. And so when evidence-based approaches to therapy are studied, one of the key ingredients inside of all of them is confronting avoidance. And we do that in our minds by telling the story or confronting the memories. But we take back major and important territory in our lives, not risk-taking in foolish ways, but the things that we've surrendered in terms of domains of functioning and where we go and how we connect to other people. Like who among us, after getting our hearts broken when we were little, didn't say some version of, that's it, I'll never trust again, or I'll never love again. That's to our own great peril. We did something like that. It would just become a self-amplifying loop for our own misery. In the immediacy of that, it's like, glad I don't have to deal with that. But in a
Mm,
matter of just a small amount of time, all of a sudden I'm lonely and I'm even more afraid
Yeah.
now.
mm,
So when I avoid things that I think they're going to be really threatening, all I'm doing is intensifying the fearfulness of that stimulus and I'm keeping myself really stuck. And
mm,
so one of the really cool things that we do with people in therapy is we help them to do some really brave things. They basically, in a very process-based way, in real time and then outside of the therapy hour in their lives, they get to live out one of the key principles of all of our favorite fairy tales or children's stories, that in order to be brave, you first have to be afraid.
mm,
And yet some dragons are worth slaying or some journeys are worth going on.
Mm.
For some individuals who have experienced trauma and they've been very stuck, one of the things that's probably kept them stuck are patterns of avoidance.
mm,
And so finding a therapist that they can do evidence-based therapy with, but then also expectations matter a lot. If I tell my kid that she's never going to be good at school, well, data are pretty clear on that. Probably not going to be very good at school. If on the other hand, I tell my kid, if you keep trying, you can do an awful lot in your life. You just got to work like crazy and not give up. Sometimes I think as a therapist, I can use my sort of positional power, or even in a setting like this, like whenever the audience reaches for something like this and whatever credibility they might ascribe to some bald guy on something like this, it's like post-traumatic growth is a real and valid construct and possibility for lots of other people all over the world. Then what if it was true for me?
Yeah.
And the story that has kept me stuck, for example, that I can't try new things, or that I can't relate to other people compassionately, or that I'll never be able to trust and connect with God again, or that I'm not strong. What if I were to just challenge that a little bit and live as if it wasn't true? Like, what if I disobeyed that part of my mind,
I
which
like
says
that.
I can do this, or I can't do that, or I must? And what if I were to live today in a way that walked in the opposite direction?
Mm.
I can't remember that. Psychotherapy says, yeah, we can and we're going to. Because I can't go back to certain places, or I can never go on a date again. I could never. So I'm going to create a hierarchy and we're going to confront some of these things, because the only thing worse than being a trauma survivor is being a trauma survivor that stays stuck in a self-amplifying loop
Yeah.
of avoidance
mm,
and stays miserable
Mhm.
alone. We're better together. And I
mm,
would say that healing from trauma is very quick for most people. None of this is, you're not trying to be Pollyanna about any of this, or overly optimistic
mm,
about it. If you look at the 4 or 5 best studied approaches to trauma treatment, they are like between 5 and 15 appointments when they're
mm,
studied. And for the overwhelming majority of people that go through that, it really helps them. Hopefully, in terms of 2 areas, and this is something that I talk to everybody about, is something that I think is
mm,
germane to everybody, whether or not they're trying to overcome a traumatic wound or just trying to build a meaningful life. A lot of us have things that are present and that are problematic. And so a trauma survivor, that might be avoidance and hypervigilance and exaggerated sort of stuff that's here that I want to get rid of a bit. But then also the problem
mm,
of absence is the issue that we need to think.
Mm.
Not just the symptoms that I don't want anymore, but parts of my life that I want to build out, the habits in my life that I want to have, things in my life I want to build towards. It's not enough just to amputate a waste. It's like for somebody with a substance use disorder, it'd be good if they didn't drink anymore, didn't use the substance anymore.
Mm.
What would also be really important is they'd fill that void with something that actually offers life.
mm,
And so the problem of what's present and the problem of what's absent, that's how I think about what healing might look like for
Mm.
somebody who's wanting to build a life after a trauma event. How do I drive down some of these symptoms? Although the cost of admission to life in this world is going to be some sadness and anxiety and trauma
Absolutely.
exposure.
Yeah.
But then also,
mm,
how am I building into these domains of connection to others,
Mm.
connection to God, new possibilities, newfound strength, that kind of thing?
I think that's a
mm,
great different mindset. You said 2 things that jumped out, just that absent like focusing on what's absent. What do you want in life? Because I think we can be stuck on what has been lost or symptoms that we have,
That's
but
it.
it's like focus on what do you want? It can give us a different kind of trajectory. And then also, I just loved where you were like, disobey that part of your brain. And I'm a rule follower, but
Oh,
I got like really excited when you said that. I was like, oh,
oh,
I got
I'll
permission to
tell you
The
what,
disobey.
Dell.
yeah, and if I can share something personal with you, I've lost like
Mm-hmm.
70 pounds in the last couple of years,
Mm.
and
Hmm.
actually like the last 18 months.
Wow.
And
Wow.
like many people in the military, I got out of the military and I immediately just gained a bunch of weight because I was no longer working in an organization which would fire me if my waist got too big, or I no
Hmm.
longer was going to go do physical training with my comrades over the lunch break or whatever. I just became a civilian, drank too much alcohol, I ate too much garbage, I gained all kinds of weight. And
Hmm.
like many Americans, I had lots of fluctuation in weight over the course of my life and had done different diets and things like that. I came to realize in my 40s that I could out eat any exercise plan so quickly. Yeah, I could go run
Hmm.
for 10 miles and then I could eat a piece and a half of cheesecake and just totally undo
Yeah.
it. It was the first time I decided to do something different with nutrition. But the way in which that I was able to do it, it started with love. Like when our second daughter was born, I realized that I'm going to be an old man when she graduates from high school, at least a lot older than a bunch of my peers and their kids graduating from high school. My wife and I are in our 40s. And so I thought I want to be the healthiest version of me possible so that I can live as maximally and connected to them as I can during these formative years of their life. I want to be a participative and healthy dad. And in order to do that, I'm going to start challenging some of the rules that I have about when I eat and what kinds of food I eat.
Mm.
Like I had rules in my head about how I was somehow entitled to drink gin on Fridays and Saturdays, or that I always had to eat meat for every meal, or that I had to eat 3 meals a day.
Mm.
Sort of one of the things that's so cool about disobeying our mind is if we start it in a really small way. This is something I do with people in therapy a lot. You have somebody order their favorite horrible meal at their worst restaurant, like being that for me, this would be going to McDonald's and ordering 2 triple cheeseburgers and 2 McChicken sandwiches, which I can inhale so quickly. So somebody orders all of that and they go through the drive-thru and they've got it in the bag, it's in the car. You've got that weird amalgamation of both like thrilling dopamine about ready to surge, but also like self-loathing and guilt about even sitting in the line and
Mhm.
actually probably pull out, whatever. And so then you have them take a single bite from one sandwich and throw the rest in the trash can and drive
Oh.
away. It takes somebody who's got an obsession about germs and you have them touch a public doorknob and then lick their finger. I'm going to disobey the part of my mind that says, you must,
Yes.
or you can,
Mhm.
or you always. It's like, yeah, I'm going to do something different.
Mhm.
I'm going to flex my agency
Yes.
and I'm going to learn from
Mm.
it. This is why I love acceptance and commitment therapy, because you do this kind of stuff. And it's why I do it a lot when I go and I speak in different places. Or what if we were to
Yeah,
have an
wow.
experience together here where we did something almost like an experiment? And some experiments fail. And sometimes I'll try something with somebody and they're like, that's the biggest waste of my time ever. I'll never get that hour back from my
Yeah.
life. But
Totally, yeah.
the real turning for people is sort of, oh, hey, I've told myself this. What's really sad about it is it's not about in front of your own mind or judging yourself for having these thoughts. For a lot of us, if we were to go back in our history, the origin for some of these stories are outside of us. It was a peer or a bully or an experience where our heart was broken, or an adult that we should have been able to trust who said something to us about our worth or our lovability, or what kind of a screwed up mess we were, how embarrassing we were, how shameful we were. Man, we like signed that to ourselves and we carried it with us. And we've said it so often, it's a habit, but it's not a fact. And so I think disobeying our minds allows us, I think, to be aware of what these thoughts are and the emotions that come with them. But then also to think about it from the vantage point of, I'm going to always hurt the most where I care the most. So if something causes me a lot of anxiety, it's a signpost to significance in my heart. Something that matters to me is being threatened. This is what grief is, right? I'm going to grieve the hardest, the things that I love the most. If I can find that thing I care and disobey my mind to do something brave or connection oriented or spiritual or religious, in my behaviors, I have a ton of control over my behavior. I asked you
Mhm.
guys to put both your hands up. Well, you could probably do that unless you're paralyzed or something. Now, if I said,
Uh-huh.
I want you to just experience intense joy for the next 15 seconds, just go ahead. It's like, I don't exactly know how to manufacture that.
Right.
It's like, I
Right.
want you to definitely don't think about zebras. Whatever you do, don't think of zebras. Don't ever think of
That's
zebras.
unfair.
Like,
It's unfair.
it's very hard
Right.
for us to always have a lot of control over what we think or feel. Those things
Mm,
come and go, but our behaviors, oh my
Mm.
goodness,
mhm.
that's where evolution occurs in these small micro movements.
Yeah.
So anyway, I know that's an awful
Yeah.
long answer, but I think it has a lot to do
Mm.
with those elements. And
Yeah.
it's
Oh,
kind
it's
of
so
such a privilege
hopeful.
for me to see that unfold for people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. As you just as you're speaking about it this way, it's like maybe even me being a therapist and all of the reading I've done, we buy a little bit into how hard things are to change, and that it's just good to hear that there's hope and that,
Oh,
you can turn
well, and
things
I think,
around and
Switch by Chip and Dan Heath, brilliant approach to
mm.
this and
Mm,
small successive changes. James Clear wrote a great book
Oh,
called
habits,
Atomic
yeah.
Habits a year or two ago. That's
So
really helpful. The
mm.
small, tiny, even Susan David's approach to this with emotional agility. She's out of Harvard, but he talks a lot
Mm.
about some of the very things I just mentioned. If we can find values that are deep in our hearts and then move out on them in
Mm.
small
Mhm.
qualities of action, we get to build really meaningful lives. And
Yeah,
here's, I think,
yeah.
what that looks like. And I've seen this happen for a lot of people, very similar to the Mephibosheth story, where the first thing you learn about Mephibosheth is he's lame in both feet. As a result of trauma that happened to him when he was 5, when a nurse dropped him and he broke his legs.
mm,
And the last thing that you learn about him is that he's lame in both of his feet. And
Mm.
so in this world, we will have trouble. And
Mm.
there is no kind of promise that all of the problem of what's present will be ameliorated.
mm,
In fact, I
Yeah.
oftentimes I'm drawn to acceptance-oriented therapies
mm.
because outside of a frontal lobotomy or a bottle in front of me, I have no idea how to give somebody amnesia for trauma in their life.
Yeah.
You don't get
Yeah.
past it unless you have a brain injury, and
Yeah.
who's going to
Mm.
prescribe it?
Right.
So my history is my history. I'm going to carry that with me. And the world's
Yeah.
going to continue to break my heart. In fact, for the three of us on the call, perhaps the worst trauma or loss or grief experience in our life hasn't happened yet. It's very likely that's the
Mm.
case. And so in a world so full of trauma, where our hearts will be battered and broken, if we intend to live meaningful, connected lives, then focusing on the problem of what's absent or on building a meaningful life in the direction of these domains makes all the more sense.
Yeah.
It's not a
Mm.
matter of, are we going to experience trauma? We are going to experience those big time traumas. People we love are going to die.
Yeah.
We're going to have exposure to things that we can't really compute.
Mm.
We're going to bear witness to that in the lives of other people that we care for, maybe even people that we're responsible to protect, are going to get really hurt.
Mm.
Other than
Yeah.
avoiding that, hiding from that, distracting ourselves with a million hedonic kind of things that we could turn our attention to,
Mm.
or drowning it in
Mm.
alcohol, binge watching, or whatever.
Yeah.
What if it was the case that we could still build a meaningful life, even
Mm.
in a traumatized world, even when our hearts are still broken? I think that's possible. That I could
Yeah.
cultivate kind of qualities where I can be a better dad or a more tender-hearted follower of Christ, the only God with scars, by the way, which I think is so
Mm.
unique to that
Mhm.
worldview.
Yeah.
I could continue to build a meaningful life,
Mm.
even though sometimes my anxiety is going to be up here and sometimes it's going to be down there.
Mm.
And sometimes my depression will be up here
Yeah.
and sometimes it's going to be down there. And
Mm.
sometimes,
Mm.
especially around anniversaries or a lot of trauma survivors, it's certain sexual positions or times of the year, anniversaries, or sound like giant booms of fireworks, whatever their trauma exposure is, I'll always be a little sensitive to that.
Yeah.
So those symptoms come up and
Yeah.
down and up and down and up and down, but I can flip my switch to yes in terms of my willingness to be present with my life. I don't need those symptoms to totally go away in
Mm.
order to live a
Mm.
life that's worth living.
Mm.
I just think there's something so liberating
wow.
about that. Stephen Hayes writes about that
Oh,
stuff
yeah.
in his book, A Liberated Mind.
Yeah.
Dr. Adam, we have to finish, but I just feel like, man, that went so fast. I had so many questions and my mind was going, no, how is it already time? But
I know.
Andrea, do you want to say anything, any thoughts, or, you know,
No,
I can
I
see she's
how do
full.
we wrap this all up? I mean, I will
know.
just say, like, yes, I love that you brought in that acceptance piece, that there are things that we cannot change in our experience in this life. And then just looking, I love what you said. It really struck me of like, we know the only God that has scars, that he
Can I end with a
intimately
poem?
knows
I
that.
love poetry.
Do it. Yes,
Yeah,
do it.
So Edward Shalito wrote a poem. I think it's called Jesus of the Scars.
Mm.
And one of the final stanzas is it's a prayer to Christ. And he says to Christ, "The other gods were strong, but thou wast weak. They rode, but thou didst stumble to a throne. But to our wounds, only your wounds can speak, for no other God has wounds but thou alone."
Yes. Yes.
And that's the kind of eschatological hope I think that we can cling to, knowing that the
Yes.
world is likely
Yeah.
to continue to beat us down. So thanks for having me, you two. Thank you a lot.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah, it was such a pleasure, and all the best to you and your family, and
Yes.
being a dad, and just everything that you were just talking about. Like, oh, that's great stuff to be helping your children form ideas around too. So yeah, we really appreciate you. And everyone follow Dr. Adam Dell on everything.